So at the Center, and specifically the Guild, we talk a lot about restoring civility and what it looks like in this era. You've written a lot about this topic, and pulling from your background in public service, in not only the United States Senate, but also as counselor and chief of staff to decision makers in the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Justice. What role does civility play in lawmaking, and what kind of role does it play in coalition building?
Yeah, great question. So I think, first of all, we need to define the term, and I don't know that I can, first of all. So let's throw out some different theories of what civility might mean. The one it definitely doesn't mean, and I almost run from the term, because what most people hear when what pops to people's minds when they hear the term is mushy non-commitment, be really nice and don't really believe anything or fight very hard for it. And if it's that, I have no interest in civility, right? But fortunately, it doesn't have to be that, right? So I would think of the civics roots and the civil roots of the term. And I think given that our system is intentionally a combative system where there's a division of power, there are checks and balances, there's separation of power, and there are checks and balances, both vertically and horizontally. So the federal government versus the state government versus more local governments, and then the legislative versus the executive versus the judicial branches. The founders thought there's universal human dignity that predates government. We're created in God's image. We have the rights to freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, protest, the 5 great freedoms of the First Amendment. Those are pre-governmental freedoms that we're endowed with by our Creator. And government is a shared project to secure those rights and freedoms. And because no men are angels, you need government, to paraphrase Madison here, and because governors aren't angels, you need checks and balances on government. So our system was built to clash, and you're supposed to have executive and legislative branches battling. Parties were not in the founders' vision, but they emerged in the Washington cabinet, and they battle. And the federal government battles versus states. So the thing it doesn't mean is lay down any interests you have in causes that you're fighting for. But it does mean that in combat, there are rules of engagement. And so I think it's useful by analogy to think about what happens in a courtroom. When a prosecutor and a defense attorney are battling, they're both fighting really hard for the positions that they hold, but there are still rules, and you should honor the rules, and you should tell the truth, and you should keep your commitments. And so I think one of the nasty things that's happening in our politics right now is people are willing to say, because my cause is just, and not even many people really care that much about that, but because those guys and gals are SOBs, because we do our politics as anti-politics, and we have people trying to find identity in politics by who they can hate the most, then they think all rules should be off the table, and you should maximize power any and every way you can, and especially by violating the 9th commandment. Lie about everybody else, bear false witness, try to play media games where you always cherry pick the worst portion of your opponent's clip and always clean yours up and don't admit that you stealth edited it. Like, that kind of nasty is uncivil, and we should all be against that. But it starts with a shared sense of what is this limited calling that is politics? And it's to advocate hard for certain views about the use of power. But in my view, power is not the heart of life. The heart of life is love. It's persuasion, it's neighborliness, it's family, it's community, it's innovation. The really interesting things are at the Little League and the Rotary Club and your church, right? Politics is just to maintain a framework for that. And you need to fight about that framework, but you needed to do it in a way that assumes your interlocutor is somebody who has dignity.
Yeah. So you mentioned human dignity in your answer. And so how do you legislate with human dignity in mind? I know that's a huge question to ask, but I'm asking in context of the CARES Act, the $2.2 trillion stimulus relief bill that was passed earlier this year. I don't think anybody could have anticipated that we would have COVID-19 or that you'd have to lawmake in this time. How do you approach this season?
Yeah, so first of all, you're right. The size of COVID CARES, you're naming the legislative term properly, but we often call it COVID 2.0, COVID 3.0, 3.5, and now what's sort of caught up is the 4.0 debate. the bills from COVID 1 to 2 to 3, 3.5 was a refreshing of the Paycheck Protection Program inside 3.0. They got progressively larger, and the size of them now is really mind-boggling. So you remember when President Obama was elected in November of 2008, in January, February of 2009, they passed the stimulus bill, which was the largest thing the government had ever done before by far, and it was $790 billion. And now we're talking about something that's not orders of magnitude, but trillions of dollars bigger than that, and that was only one of many tranches of COVID funding. So I voted for the legislation because I thought on net there's more good stuff than bad stuff, but I think rational people, though I guess nobody ultimately voted against it. We had 2 people out who probably would have voted against it, but were in quarantine. But people who were against it should admit there's still good things in it, and those of us who voted for it should admit that there are bad things in it, but the bad things were both things that you didn't agree with to begin with, and things that had secondary and tertiary consequences that couldn't have been anticipated at that moment. So I think the first thing to recognize is, let's not do good versus evil talk about a big omnibus piece of legislation. Let's admit that it's a bunch of sausage and then start to disentangle underneath it. Then it allows reasonable people to have nuanced spectrum decisions, not 100 to 0 or 0 to 100, because the reality is there's a lot of different stuff in there. And if you want, we can talk about the vaccine accelerator versus ramping up the testing versus the unemployment supplemental payments versus the X, Y, and Z. There's just so many different things in it. I think it's useful to have a lot of shades of gray in how we talk about an omnibus legislative package.
Yeah, so when you talk about the shades of gray, how do you decide what's important? How do you weigh the darker gray versus the lighter gray when you try to make these decisions?
So let me head towards something that I hope is a universal principle, but maybe I'll start by saying something that, as a person well right of center on the spectrum, that informs how I think about it. I think we should prioritize the most important things in a big legislative package, and we should try to do the first things first, and then you can get to more things. There's never any reason why this package has to be the last time we ever have a conversation. You can legislate, do less than some people might think is ideal, see how the parts went that we did, and then come back and add more to it. I don't think it's a great thing to take the approach that Speaker Pelosi usually takes now, which is to say she wants everything she wants, and even if the package that's offered as the counter proposal is a bunch of things that she wants, but not everything on her wish list, then she's going to be opposed to it because she thinks this moment is the last moment we can ever talk. And I think that's more a function of our media consumption habits and the way we've tried to immediatize, to go theology nerd, to eminentize the eschaton. Legislation often acts like we're bringing about heaven and hell by what we're doing today, and that's just never true. So inside this legislative package, CARES 3.0 in particular, to me, the thing that got me to yes, even though there's a lot I didn't like in it, was the vaccine accelerator was really important and really urgent. And in particular, we have amazing drug development capabilities in the US, but lots of that research firepower and bandwidth is in the private sector. That is great. The competition that comes from the US pharma industry leads to some of the best innovation on earth. And sitting here in North Carolina, we're just down the road from lots of these companies and researchers and brains. But you wanted to be sure that in a moment of crisis, like COVID ramp and spread, that we were going to do everything we could to get to a publicly good, valuable vaccine in a hurry. And so my colleague Steve Daines, senator from Montana, was our leader, and I was sort of riding sidecar with him on this, that we created this vaccine accelerator idea, where we said that, but by the way, there are 5 US companies that have clinical trials going for a COVID vaccine. 3 of the 5 companies have their trial in the US. You often hear the number 3, but really there's a US company in Europe and a US company in Asia also running clinical trials. Those 5 companies, if they're making a private sector net present value prudent calculation, if they think they're not likely to be first to the win and therefore to the intellectual property value, then they might let their foot off the accelerator. And so we created an initiative that said everybody run through the tape at the end, and ultimately we'll reimburse, the US taxpayer will reimburse the 4 losing companies for all of their expenses plus 10% when somebody else wins the race. I think that was a really important piece of policy. And I wish we'd have just done that as a standalone and done it 3 or 4 weeks earlier and then moved on to the next issue, the next issue, the next issue. But right now, we live in a weird time of coalition politics where there isn't really a majority view of anything in U.S. government or politics right now. There are a whole bunch of minority positions, and a lot of those minority identities are sort of anti-identities about who they're against in politics. And so we ended up with a package that, in my view, was worth voting for because it had lots of good things in it, and yet was a clunky package that also had a lot of things in it that I wish weren't there, but I think that was the exigency of an urgent moment.
Yeah. How does your faith inform your views on policy? You mentioned that you were right of center. How does your faith inform that?
Well, first of all, by wanting to be sure we have a lot of one cheer for politics, people and rhetorical space, meaning that government is important, but government can quickly, or politics more precisely, can quickly become an idol for people. Humans are always trying to fill vacuums in our souls, and in a Babylonian world, in a Tower of Babel world, we all are really, really divided humans, and I think that it's dangerous for people to go to politics with a religious fervor. So one of the first things I do, and I often joked with Nebraskans when I was running for office in 2013-14, I'm one of, I think, 8 people in the Senate who's never been a politician before running for office. I often joke that the reason I'm running is because I want to displace some political weirdo who might otherwise win the seat. I don't want somebody to get elected to represent Nebraska that thinks politics is the center of life, because that's not true, and Nebraskans don't believe it. And so I'll tell you a whole bunch of things I believe about politics, but I first want to have a conversation with you about rank-ordered identities, right? I'm a husband, I'm a dad, I'm a Christian, I'm a churchman, I'm a conservative, I'm a Nebraska football addict, I'm an American, I'm a Republican and a conservative, and those aren't the same thing. But when I rank order those identities, it's really important for me to never get confused that my Husker football loyalties, as deep as they are, the second most important religion of my life, it can never be rank ordered higher than being a dad. Like if at some level my passion for Husker football is distracting me from my obligations to these 3 little souls God has entrusted to me and to Melissa and me to steward for a time, I'm messed up and I need friends to come and slap me upside the head, right? In the same way, our American identity has to trump our, no pun intended, our Republican or our Democratic identities. Like, your partisan loyalties are not as important as your American identities. So I want to start by mapping the space of what can politics accomplish, and that flows deeply from my Christian commitments, that we live in a world that is broken because of Adamic sin that I've inherited and that I live every day. And the eschaton, the hopes and dreams that we all have, is not going to be brought about by legislation. So first, let's have an anti-statist public philosophy that says no politics as religion. Now let's fight about stuff like, what's the right strategy to deal with a world of ever shorter duration at a firm? Because 20 and 30-somethings are going to get disrupted from work in ways that our forefathers and mothers have never experienced before. Nobody has ever not had a sense that they're going to find lifelong work by the age of 16 to 24. And we got 30 and 40-somethings who are going to be disrupted out of jobs every 5 years forever now. And so we need to rethink the future of job retraining. Well, it turns out Republican versus Democrat or progressive versus conservative ideology didn't have a lot to say about that in 1920, 1960, or 1990. So I think a lot more of our politics are past versus future, not really right versus left. And even though I'm very conservative, I try to bring a perspective to politics that doesn't start with the assumption that somebody on the left side of the voting continuum in the US Senate is a devil because we didn't have the same policy views 15 years ago. Most of the policy problems we need to be solving today are 15 years in the future, and I don't think either party has very good ideas.
Yeah. Well, Senator Sasse, on behalf of the Guild, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your perspective on these challenging topics.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for the work you do. It seems like a special community.